Look at a map of the Persian Gulf and you could miss it in a second. Kharg Island is small, tiny really. At first glance, it does not look like the kind of place that could shake energy markets, military planning, and global diplomacy all at once. But that is exactly what it does. Because for Iran, Kharg is not just an island. It is a financial artery, a lifeline. And if that lifeline is ever cut, the consequences would not stop at Iran's shores. Kharg Island serves as the main terminal for nearly all of Iran's oil exports, with loading capacity estimated at about 7 million barrels a day. It sits in the northern Persian Gulf, roughly 55 kilometers northwest of Bushehr, in waters deep enough for the world's largest tankers to dock. That combination is rare. And it is exactly what turned Kharg into one of the most valuable pieces of energy infrastructure in the region. And that is where the paradox begins. Iran is a large country with mountains, deserts, and enormous energy reserves. But having oil is only half the story. The other half is getting it out. And geography has never given Iran many easy options. Much of the coastline is too shallow for supertankers, while the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical oil choke points on Earth, carrying around 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption, with very few practical alternatives if it is disrupted. So over time, Kharg became more than a port. It became a funnel. And that is the real strategic problem. When too much of a country's wealth moves through one point, when that point stops being infrastructure and starts becoming a vulnerability. In military terms, it becomes a target. In geopolitical terms, it becomes leverage. That is why Kharg keeps appearing in war planning, energy analysis, and crisis diplomacy. And once a state becomes dependent on a place like that, escaping the trap is far harder than it sounds. The roots of that dependence go back decades. In the 1960s and 1970s, under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, Iran expanded its oil export system and tied more and more of that system to Kharg. The logic was obvious. The island's deep-water access made it more useful than shallower mainland ports. But the more infrastructure Iran built around Kharg, the harder it became to replace. Pipelines, storage, loading facilities, shipping patterns, export contracts, and state revenue all began to revolve around one location. What looked like efficiency gradually hardened into dependence, and eventually dependence turned into exposure. That dependence was understood in Washington long before the current war. During the 1979 hostage crisis, declassified U.S. government records show that Kharg was discussed at the highest levels of the Carter administration. Senior officials described it as probably the most critical facility in Iran. They discussed options ranging from seizure to blockade, but they also recognized the danger. Zbigniew Brzezinski warned that going after Kharg could trigger a worldwide oil crisis. In other words, even then, U.S. policymakers understood the dilemma. Kharg was important enough to hurt Iran, but important enough to hurt everyone else too. That logic still matters now, but the battlefield has changed. 40 years ago, defending an island like Kharg was easier to imagine. Radar coverage, layered air defenses, isolation at sea, and the sheer difficulty of approaching a fortified oil terminal gave Iran a real defensive advantage. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iraqi attacks repeatedly targeted the island, but Kharg remained central to Iran's export system even after serious damage. Today, the equation is harsher. Precision-guided munitions, drones, satellite surveillance, and stealth aircraft have changed what it means to be an exposed fixed target. A facility like Kharg cannot hide. It cannot move. Its storage tanks, berths, Pipelines and loading systems are all visible from above. The same geography that made it efficient now makes it exposed. In the age of modern surveillance and precision strike, visibility is danger. And that is what makes Kharg so unsettling in 2026. What once looked like a fortress can now look like a marked point on a screen. Recent events have pushed that danger from theory into practice. Reuters reported that U.S. forces struck military targets on Kharg in March 2026, while avoiding the island's oil facilities. That distinction matters. It suggests that Washington wanted to signal capability and raise pressure without detonating a full-scale energy shock. In other words, punish Iran, but do not burn down the oil market. That restraint tells you something important. Total destruction of Kharg may sound like a clean, strategic move. In reality, it could trigger chaos far beyond Iran. On paper, attacking Kharg looks simple. In reality, if the consequences could spiral fast. Analysts cited by Reuters and AP have warned that if Kharg were seized or fully disabled, Iran's exports could stall, output could fall sharply, and Tehran could retaliate across the region. That retaliation might not be limited to missiles. It could include maritime disruption, mines, attacks on Gulf infrastructure, or renewed pressure on the Strait of Hormuz itself. And that brings us to the economic core of the story. Kharg matters to Iran first, but it does not matter only to Iran. Oil moving out of Iran feeds into a much larger Asian demand system, especially China and India. More broadly, any major disruption around Kharg or Hormuz feeds straight into shipping costs, insurance risk, refinery pricing, and consumer fuel prices. That is the part that turns a remote island into a global problem. Where Reuters reported this week that oil surged sharply after new threats and continued disruption around Hormuz, and analysts warned that prices could reach around $150 a barrel if the crisis drags on. That is why a strike in the Gulf can end up hitting drivers in Texas, manufacturers in Asia, and governments far from the Middle East. This is no longer just a story about Iran's exports. It is a story about how one pressure point in the Gulf can ripple through the entire global system. And that is also why the military question is more complicated than it sounds. Could the United States or Israel hit Kharg? Yes, in some form, clearly they could. Could they occupy it and hold it without major escalation? That is far less certain. AP notes that the island's proximity to the Iranian mainland makes any occupation extremely risky. What? Because missiles, drones, and artillery could be brought to bear from nearby territory. Analysts quoted there argue that a blockade or quarantine at sea may be strategically safer than trying to plant troops on the island itself. So Kharg creates a classic strategic dilemma. Leave it alone, and Iran keeps a critical financial lifeline. Strike it too hard, and you risk detonating the very energy crisis you are trying to manage. Seize it, and you inherit a vulnerable outpost under threat from the mainland. That is why Kharg is so important. Not because it guarantees victory for anyone, but because it compresses military, economic, and political risk into one tiny space. And in that sense, Kharg Island may be one of the clearest examples of how geography still rules modern power. Technology changes, governments change. One aircraft gets stealthier, missiles get smarter, but the map still shapes the options. That was true under the Shah. It was true during the hostage crisis. And it is true again today. For Iran, Kharg is a lifeline. For its enemies, it is leverage. For energy markets, it is a warning. And for the rest of the world, it is proof that the most dangerous place in a crisis is not always the place with the most headlines. Sometimes it is a small island that almost nobody notices at first, a dot in open water, a fixed target, a financial artery, a place where geography, war, and oil all collide. And that is why Kharg matters. Because if this island is ever pushed fully into the center of the conflict, the shock would not stay in the Persian Gulf. It would travel through tankers, through prices, through supply chains, and straight into the daily lives of people thousands of miles away. That is the real danger here. Not just what Kharg means for Iran, but what it means for everyone if that lifeline is ever broken.